Good morning. I want to start by saying how honoured I am to be awarded the Elizabeth Warrington Prize. I hold the BNS in the highest regard, and it really is a privilege to be recognised by the Society in this way, so thank you. Today I'm going to talk about some thoughts I have had about the neuroscientific study of social interaction, which is one of the most rapidly developing domains of systems neuroscience. Over the years, social neuroscience has evolved almost entirely as a field of its own, with separate journals and societies, and with conferences that attract audiences that are distinct from those engaged in discussions about language, memory, and cognitive control, for example. As a field, it has also generally been silent on relationships to other forms of cognition and on the interface of social cognition with perception and action. As a consequence, it has primarily focused upon carving up social cognition into ever more distinct and highly specialized pieces. And there is a lack of unifying and generative theories that span multiple social phenomena. Moreover, there is little in the way of models that can predict the breakdown of social cognition, nor are there clear proposals regarding target mechanisms for rehabilitation. Recently, there have been a number of papers that have argued that progress in social neuroscience will rapidly accelerate if it embraces established and detailed models from within other, more general domains of cognition. Personally, I believe that this could greatly inform our understanding of how to assess and address the social behavioral disturbances that so often result from brain injury and disease. So over the next 40 minutes, I hope to convince you of the merits of one particular framework for establishing such connections and making new predictions. So what do I mean by social interaction? Quite simply, I mean two or more agents interacting with one another. And this will involve some or all of the following: comprehension and production of overt signals, including verbal language and paralinguistic cues, but also facial expressions and bodily gestures, just as a few examples. It will also include predicting the intentions and beliefs of others, and then planning our own behaviour and signalling to promote or prevent certain future behaviours of others. Together with Richard Ramsey of Macquarie University, I've recently proposed that a key aspect of cognition that connects all of those aspects of social interaction is semantic memory retrieval. In fact, we have gone even further to propose that social cognition can essentially be understood as a form or flavour of semantic cognition. We use the term semantic cognition to refer to a set of processes broadly involved in meaning-imbued behaviour. So indeed, whilst the term semantics is most frequently associated with language abilities, related processes are also commonly studied in the context of a wide range of non-verbal abilities and behaviours, including object perception and interaction, action perception and planning, and a range of socio-affective processes, including person identification and emotion recognition. Let me be clear. I am by no means the first to highlight a link between social cognition and semantic cognition. In fact, as I will discuss a little later in the talk, the field of neuropsychology has offered compelling evidence to this effect. But I am arguing that it is more than an association, and that the more one surveys the respective literatures in parallel, the more apparent it becomes that they converge in terms of the processes they describe and the brain regions they implicate, perhaps to a point that they are largely one and the same. In the next part of this talk, I will say a little more on what semantic cognition is comprised of and why I believe theories of semantic cognition should be considered relevant to the neuropsychology of interpersonal behaviours. As promised, I will also briefly review some key antecedent observations that link the two. Then I will present the focus of my talk, which is some recent work where myself and colleagues have begun directly probing the relationship between the neurobiology of social and semantic cognition. So again, semantic cognition refers to a set of processes, broadly involved in meaning-imbued behavior. Now, one expects that social interactions will involve semantic cognition because in all their forms, they fundamentally involved extracting meaning from complex sets of social cues, and also using this meaningful information to guide responses that are coherent, effective, and context appropriate. According to the controlled semantic cognition framework, this is underpinned by two key systems. The first system supports the acquisition and long-term storage of conceptual level knowledge about objects, people, abstract concepts, and events. This semantic knowledge is multimodal, and we gradually acquire it over our lifetime experiences of sensory motor, linguistic, situational experience. The second system, the semantic control system, comprises a set of processes that regulate activation of semantic knowledge, ensuring that aspects of conceptual information that are most critical for the situation are brought to the fore, and that irrelevant information is suppressed. For example, there are certain features of this tone, written in red, that are irrelevant to its primary use. However, they are relevant in other task contexts when we need semantic control to access these subdominant features. Several decades of neuropsychological findings indicate that semantic representation and semantic control can be dissociably affected by brain injury or disease. It was Professor Elizabeth Warrington, in collaboration with Ros McCarthy, who first drew the central distinction between and documented storage and access deficits in semantic cognition. Now, this cartoonish schematic nicely illustrates the difference between a loss of semantic memory or a storage deficit and an access impairment in which the conceptual store is intact, but the access mechanism is broken. A more recent set of neuropsychological case series by Matt Lambenrauth and Beth Jeffries maintain and support this distinction at a mechanistic level. But they also underscore a dissociation with regards to the neural correlates of semantic knowledge representation and the associated control system, as illustrated here in this figure. The neural correlates of semantic knowledge are localized in this figure in red, while semantic control regions are in green. This neurobiologically constrained framework is now supported by a compelling set of cognitive neuroscience data, including functional imaging and non-invasive brain stimulation studies. Now, on the right is a schematic of the brain network implicated primarily on the basis of functional neuroimaging studies in social cognition. From my perspective, there is a high degree of overlap in the neurobiological basis of social and semantic cognition, and in three particular regions: the anterior temporal lobe in red, the ventrolateral frontal lobe, and the temporal parietal junction. But this potential overlap is seldom directly explored. So to what an extent this overlap exists, both in terms of anatomy and cognitive function, is the very question addressed by some of my current work. And as I will discuss later, I'm particularly intrigued as to whether social cognitive impairments might also be distinguished along the lines of storage and access deficits, or deficits of representation versus control. So what reasons are there to believe that there is a connection between social cognition and semantic cognition? Some of the earliest and most compelling evidence exists in classic comparative neurological studies performed at University College London in the 1880s. These were by Sandra Brown and Sir Edward Schaefer, and more famously later by Heinrich Kluwer and Paul Bucy in 1939. They all performed bilateral full-depth temporal lobectomies upon non-human primates, and they observed profound post-operative changes in social behavior, and this included emotional blunting and aggressive hypersexuality. While these studies are commonly cited in psychology textbooks for the association between anterior temporal cortices and social disturbances, the original aims of the authors was to establish whether bilateral lesions led to visual and auditory associative agnosias, or as they called it, psychic blindness. Indeed, they did. And in fact, the monkeys presented with a broad symptom complex comprising multimodal semantic impairments. And these semantic impairments might actually explain rather than just co-present with socio-affective disturbances. Interestingly, I think, and the relevance of this should hopefully become apparent a little later, they found that none of those symptoms, those social behavioral symptoms, appeared after resections that were limited to the dorsolateral convolutions of the temporal lobe. Nor did they present after severing connections of the temporal lobe to the frontal lobe, or connections of the temporal lobe to the occipital lobes. Now, Kluver and Bucy finished their seminal paper with the comment that the primate symptoms were very, very similar to those described by Arnold Pick around 1904, but in human patients. These patients were suffering from a condition that today is known as frontotemporal dementia, or FTD, and some would have presented with a subtype of FTD, more specifically known as semantic dementia. Semantic dementia is characterized by a selective impairment of semantic memory that was first described in detail in 1970s by Elizabeth Warrington. Since then, John Hodges, Carolyn Patterson, and numerous colleagues have extensively shown how the central semantic impairment is apparent in both expressive and receptive semantic tasks, and across all modalities, including spoken and written language, picture-based tasks, environmental sounds tasks, object use, and so on. Importantly, they present with relative sparing of other cognitive functions, such as everyday memory and visuospatial skills. In addition, these patients also present with profound disturbances in social behavior. This includes blunted affect, decreased empathy, and impaired theory of mind. A number of research groups have published compelling series of empirical descriptions, but this case history from Edwards, Lee, Bruce Miller, and others nicely captures some of the parallel semantic and social impairments. In addition to word comprehension impairment and anomia, symptomatic of a semantic deficit, this patient developed sometimes bizarre and often inappropriate behavior. This is a multifaceted set of impairments. And yet, semantic dementia is associated with relatively focal atrophy. In this coronal MRI, labeled case 1, we can see a case example of cortical thinning in semantic dementia, which typically is mostly limited to the 5 convolutions of the temporal lobe. This atrophy is bilateral, although it's commonly asymmetrically distributed. The funny looking image next to it is a glass brain and reveals projections of brain pathology in 3 dimensions. In this case, we are not seeing a map of atrophy, but of glucose hypermetabolism, and therefore cortical dysfunction possibly beyond the location of MRI visible damage. Nonetheless, it suggests that both the multimodal semantic impairments and social deficits in semantic dementia are linked with focal atrophy, limited to the bilateral anterior temporal lobes, which is a region I have marked in red in this more familiar looking schematic. So the question that has preoccupied my mind is whether this reflects multiple systems tightly packed into this one brain region, or alternatively, whether we're It's an impairment of a single unified system underpinning social and semantic cognition. In order to address this question, I have tried to leverage the higher spatial resolution of magnetic resonance imaging and ask whether certain subregions of the ATL are particularly important for semantic tasks. However, we were initially faced with the problem that conventional fMRI is not sensitive to activation in all parts of the ATL. To explain very briefly, because the anterior temporal lobe, or ATL, sits next to thick bone and large sinuses, there are disturbances in the static magnetic field of an MRI machine that causes fMRI signal dropout and image distortion. And this weakens our ability to detect bold signal, particularly in the ventrolateral surface of the ATL. This is illustrated in this figure from the year 2000, in which Joe Devlin and colleagues contrast the results of a PET activation experiment in red and those of an fMRI experiment in green. These two experiments used the same semantic categorization task and stimuli, and while PET has an overall lower sensitivity to activation, you can see that PET is not blind to ATL activations like fMRI is. So colleagues including Laura Parks, Jeff Parker, and AJ Halai have over the years helped us develop and refine new fMRI techniques to overcome these issues. And this involves ATL optimized sequences and post-acquisition distortion correction. In one of the very first ATL optimized fMRI studies, I looked at ATL activations while neurotypical adults performed a synonym judgment task that we knew semantic dementia patients really struggle with. So for example, participants needed to decide which of three options most closely matched the meaning of the probe in bold. The probe being twist and hopefully the option you would agree is turn. We used a straightforward block design to contrast this task with an equally demanding non-semantic task involving number magnitude judgments. The results very clearly indicated that semantic processing engages the basal surface of the anterior temporal lobe much more robustly than any other part of the ATL. It's circled in red on this figure just here, to be clear what I mean. In this figure, the activations displayed are all statistically significant semantic activations, but the blue regions in the superior ATL were more weakly activated than the ventrolateral regions displayed in red to yellow. Soon after this study, Maya Visser with Matt Lamben-Ralph reported a complementary fMRI study in which equivalent responses of this ventrolateral ATL area were observed for verbal and non-verbal versions of the camel and cactus semantic association test. And so at this point, it was becoming clear that the ventrolateral ATL in particular is the cross-modal center point of a semantic knowledge hub. These results also inspired us to revisit data from Claire Galton, who quantified cerebral volume loss in each of the temporal gyri amongst a cohort of patients with semantic dementia. In these top two panes, we are looking at a coronal MRI of a healthy participant on the left and a semantic dementia patient on the right. Each of the colored sections are corresponding regions of interest within which we compared semantic activation in our fMRI experiment against volume loss in semantic dementia patients. We observed a striking similarity across the two datasets in that fMRI revealed that the most activated part of the ATL is the same ventrolateral region that is the most atrophied ATL subregion in semantic dementia. Around the same time, in the same year, Marco Mion, Peter Nestor and colleagues found in SD patients, their hypermetabolism, specifically within this ventrolateral ATL region, correlated with performance in both receptive and expressive semantic tasks. Again, this supports the notion that the ventrolateral ATL is the cross-modal center point of the semantic knowledge hub. Meanwhile, in a parallel set of studies, Roland Zahn's group and Ingrid Olsen's group were using fMRI with identical tasks and similar block designs to investigate the contribution of the ATL to the processing of social stimuli, and particularly words with social significance like truth, honor, and so forth. In contrast to our studies on general semantic processing, they identified a more superior polar region, shown on the left here, and also in purple. This gave rise to the proposal that the polar ATL plays a domain-specific role in the representation of social semantic knowledge. So in effect, there was what we might call a dual hub theory emerging. As illustrated crudely in this figure here, it came to appear as if social semantics are stored within the polar ATL region in purple, whereas more general, possibly object semantics, are represented in the ventrolateral ATL, shown here in red. To explore this possibility further, in a further fMRI study, we re-examined the role of the different ATL subregions in processing social words and non-social words. We used the same stimuli as the Zahn and Olsen studies, shown here at the top of the screen, whilst ensuring we used fMRI techniques that are optimizing for detecting ventrolateral ATL activation, these techniques we discussed earlier. We also took another important methodological step, which was to carefully control for differences between non-social and social words in terms of extraneous lexical semantic variables, such as frequency and imageability, and some others like Paul Hoffman's semantic diversity measure. Roland Zahn's original non-social words were a set of animal function words, such as trainable, and social words were on average more abstract than these non-social words. Therefore, we created a third closely matched set of abstract non-social words to contrast against the social abstract words. The findings of this ROI analysis were reported in Cerebral Cortex in 2016. We found that there was indeed a category selective activation for social words in the polar region, marked once again in purple. However, in the ventrolateral region, there was a much greater response. And what is more, this region activated in response to social words and non-social words, both animal function and these abstract non-social concepts, to an equal degree. In a follow-up study led by Grace Price, we made further comparisons of ATL activation in response to social and non-social stimuli. But this time, we focused upon concrete concepts. This is because the polar region had previously also been implicated in the representation of unique entities, like people, and also specific level concepts, like Dalmatians, as opposed to basic level concepts like dog. And so our concrete social concepts consisted of famous people, such as Leo, George, and Barack here. And the participants were asked to match one of the two choices to the probe item, the probe being Leo in this case, on the basis of occupation. The non-social trials were items from the camel and cactus test. In this test, stimuli are mostly semantically associated in terms of shared contexts or co-occurrence. For example, the dromedary and the cactus go together because they allegedly coexist in the desert. Because we expect conceptual knowledge retrieval to be independent of the type of input, we also had our subjects complete both verbal and non-verbal versions of the tasks. The pattern of results matched the previous study very well, in that there was a slight difference in activation of the polar ATL in the direction of social concepts. But in the ventrolateral region, there was a much larger response. And this was also indifferent to whether concepts were social, non-social, or presented in the verbal or non-verbal domain. So the picture that has emerged out of findings such as these is not one of divisions or distinct functions. Instead, the whole ATL region seems to be better categorized as a single semantic hub, albeit with, in some places, some subtle graded differences in a relative specialization of semantic function. This specialization could include one towards processing socially relevant information. We've suggested that graded specialization of the polar ATL region might be driven by a proximity to and greater connectivity to limbic and prefrontal structures involved in processing valenced social cues, for example. So in contrast to the orange area, the red area, the ventrolateral region, appears to be a supramodal semantic center point. And critically, this is involved in processing all types of semantic information. With all that said, the tasks that I just showed you are not very typical for studies of social cognition. Therefore, in our more recent work, we sought to map out ATL activations evoked by more traditional, high-level social tasks. Such tasks include moral judgments, watching or listening to socio-emotional stories and scenes, and making inferences about the thoughts, feelings, and intentions of others. All of these tasks have been shown to activate the ATL to some degree. However, fMRI studies of social cognition have not typically been concerned with the types of imaging artifacts that I described earlier, and it is far from clear as to whether they commonly engaged the key ventrolateral subregion of the ATL that we have been discussing. As a starting point, we have focused upon theory of mind tasks, which require participants to take the perspective of others. Theory of mind processes are central to the construct of social cognition and are considered as fundamental to social interactions, in that they enable us to describe, explain, and predict behavior. In fMRI, the most commonly used theory of mind tasks include brief social vignettes, such as the false belief task on the left, cartoons, and animations that are intended to evoke the attribution of intentions. The most recognizable of these stimuli are the Hyder and Simmel animations, in which geometric shapes move around the screen in ways that simulate human-like interaction and suggest certain thoughts and intentions. We chose these stimuli as our main focus because they do not directly involve language processing, and also because they lend themselves to the creation of a comparable control or baseline activation condition, which is something that fMRI studies need to have as far as possible. So Eva Balgova, who is doing her PhD in my lab, scanned people while they viewed a more recent version of these animations, shown in the middle panel here, and asked people to judge whether the shapes were being friendly or unfriendly to one another. She created a control task involving a simple perceptual judgment. Are the two circles going at the same speed as each other? The control stimuli were also shapes making complex movements. So we could control for low-level perceptual process as well as general task demands. But the movements occurred in a way that fails to evoke the perception of agency and interaction. Oops. when Eva looked at the activation uniquely associated with the theory of mind task, Eva found that the bilateral ATL, and particularly the ventrolateral region, was robustly engaged by the theory of mind task. To be absolutely clear, the same region that robustly activates for all semantic stimuli in the aforementioned tasks is also activated during theory of mind tasks. She also found that the ventrolateral region is activated by two other theory of mind paradigms, the false belief vignettes and the partly cloudy movie. What you are seeing here is the results of a conjunction analysis performed on data collected from all three theory of mind tasks in the same group of subjects. The white patch you can see on the rendered brain figure is the point of three-way overlap. This was an important intermediate result because showing common activation across a diverse set of theory of mind tasks with a variety of stimuli means that we can argue with a greater level of confidence that the activation in the ventral ATL can be attributed to a particular cognitive process, theory of mind, and not just idiosyncratic features of the stimuli or task demands. Finally, though, Eva made a key comparison of ATL activation that occurs during the main theory of mind task and that which occurs during a non-verbal semantic task, which was the camel and cactus task I showed you earlier. And here we have the results of this further conjunction analysis. It's a little difficult to see in parts of this figure, but in yellow, you will observe overlap, specifically within the ventrolateral ATL region. That is purported to be the semantic representation or center point. On the basis of this, we came to the conclusion that ATL activation during the theory of mind tasks reflects the engagement of semantic representations in social cognitive tasks. Moreover, on the basis of the previous slide I showed you, we can say that this engagement occurs irrespective of whether the theory of mind tasks involve verbal or non-verbal stimuli, and whether it explicitly or implicitly involves judgments about the perspectives or intentions of others. An outstanding issue that many of you will immediately pick up on is laterality, with the theory of mind tasks seemingly bilaterally activating the ATL, but the semantic task presenting a more left lateralized pattern. Such a pattern has been a basis for claims that the right ATL is more specialized for social stimuli than the left ATL. However, I think if I go back to this previous slide, it becomes apparent that beyond this point of convergence in white, there is considerable variation in the way these three theory of mind tasks activate the ATL, and the way they activate other putative social regions, such as the temporal parietal junction. To me, this isn't a surprise, given the differences in stimuli and in task demands I mentioned before. We know from experience in looking at semantic tasks that factors such as whether the task is receptive or expressive, covert or overt, whether it involves pictures, words, or environmental sounds, pushes some of the activation around from left to right and up and down. Therefore, we should be cautious about over-interpreting the differences between pairs of tasks, and especially in the context of small sample sizes. Instead, it is much more meaningful to look at reliable trends across large numbers of studies and large numbers of participants. And this is what Eva has been doing. So Eva has been doing this in collaboration with Veronica Deveka, who is also doing her PhD under my supervision, and also Dr. Becky Jackson at the MRC CBU in Cambridge. In a monumental combined effort, the three of them have performed large-scale reviews of published neuroimaging studies of semantic cognition, broadly construed, on one hand, and theory of mind, again broadly construed, on the other hand. This is with the end goal of performing formal meta-analyses and comparing and contrasting networks involved in social and semantic cognition. As can be seen in the example on screen, For theory of mind alone, data collection for the meta-analysis involved screening over 500 abstracts and reading the full text of over 260 studies published between 2014 and 2020. We systematically applied inclusion and exclusion criteria, ensuring studies met basic conditions such as employing task-based fMRI or PET to obtain original data from healthy participants, performing whole brain analyses, in other words, they're not constrained to regions of interest or small volumes, and reporting results in a standard stereotactic space. Moreover, studies were only included if they reported activation coordinates that resulted from univariate contrasts clearly aimed at identifying the process of interest. In this case, that was theory of mind. And so studies that looked at emotion recognition, trait inference, empathy, etc., were not included. Where possible, we based our searches for studies upon prior meta-analyses, but incorporating new literature published in the years since. And we also applied more conservative inclusion criteria, which we could because we had more studies. And this resulted in more carefully curated data sets. And here you can see a list of reasons for which we rejected 54 studies that were included in a prior meta-analysis. Now, this all resulted in the identification of around 100 usable theory of mind neuroimaging experiments and 200 in the domain of semantic cognition. These studies were then characterized by Eva in great detail, particularly in terms of the types of tasks used, the modality of stimuli, and the types of control or baselines conditions used. This enabled Eva to group studies and systematically look at the effect of certain types of task and using certain types of stimuli on activation. This was done formally using a coordinate-based meta-analysis using the revised activation likelihood estimation algorithm. This method treats group-level activation coordinates from published studies as data points and quantifies the convergence of results across experiments. There is a lot of really complex and interesting information that has arisen from this set of meta-analyses, but I've only got time to really quickly share with you the omnibus result. The analysis presented here pulls across all different types of tasks and stimuli used. And so it reveals the pervasive core networks underpinning theory of mind in green, semantic cognition in red, and the shared network in blue. Actually, we were careful to exclude any social semantic studies from this analysis. That is, studies using semantic tasks that included socially relevant stimuli like faces or bodies, and also studies that contrasted between more or less socially relevant stimuli. Therefore, in this analysis, any overlap cannot be easily explained by indirect stimulation of social pathways. We see a lot of commonality between the brain networks involved in semantic and social cognition, particularly in the left hemisphere. I should also clarify that the superimposition of the green clusters over the larger blue clusters, both in the TPJ and the ATL, reflects common activation and greater activation for theory of mind tasks. So in other words, these regions are involved in both types of task. For the moment, I just want to focus on the fact that the involvement of the ATL in both theory of mind and semantic cognition is bilateral. On this basis, I argue that activation of both the left and right ATL and theory of mind reflects engagement of a general conceptual knowledge system. There are some differences, such as greater involvement of the middle temporal gyrus of the ATL in theory of mind, and particularly in the right ATL. One potential explanation for differences such as this is an imbalance in the number of tasks using non-verbal stimuli and verbal stimuli. There are far more theory of mind studies using non-verbal stimuli than verbal stimuli. And the opposite is the case in semantic cognition. So in semantic cognition, there are far more studies using verbal stimuli than there are using non-verbal stimuli. To explore this in a neat but complex set of sub-analyses, Eva has been systematically looking at the effect of including and excluding studies that present different classes of stimuli in the meta-analyses. In this second row, we can see the results of a meta-analysis that excluded all studies using non-verbal stimuli. The average size of activation clusters gets smaller, reflecting the overall number of studies in the analysis. More interestingly, though, when we control for stimulus modality, only the activation that is specific to theory of mind studies shrinks, and we are left with common bilateral ATL activation. Finally on this, I would like to note that the great majority of studies included in this analysis, both on the side of semantic cognition and theory of mind, were not using fMRI sequences that are optimized for ventral ATL activation, and hence we are not seeing much or any activation or action down there. In an extension of this, Veronica De Vecke has broadened the scope in terms of the types of social tasks we are including in our meta-analyses. She has performed a large-scale systematic review and independent coordinate-based meta-analyses on not one, but 5 subdomains of social cognition. This includes theory of mind, trait inference, which involves inferences about stable personality characteristics as opposed to fleeting states of mind, empathy for pain and empathy for emotion, and moral reasoning. These figures on this slide provide novel or updated summaries of functional imaging studies in these domains. We'd like to point out that lists of individual study characteristics, the coordinate data that we extracted, and these results are all available on the Open Science Framework webpage. And we encourage the community to use them, to explore the data and to perform further and new sub-analyses. One of Veronica's aims was to make one of the first attempts to identify a core set of brain regions involved across all these domains of social cognition. This should help uncover the overarching network and processes involved at the center of a wide range of social behaviors, heterogeneous tasks, and contexts. Here on this slide, we have mapped the results of an overlay conjunction. The colors signify the number of subdomains that reliably activated each area, with blue being the least, or 1, and orange, red being 3 or more domains. We have displayed the conjunction in this particular way because it helps get around the fact that there were vast differences in the number of experiments in each subdomain, for which of course affects the size of the clusters. We think that the color can be used as a proxy for confidence that regions are reliably part of the core social network. Key regions, not surprisingly, seem to include the TPJ, the precuneus, the medial and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and the bilateral anterior temporal lobe. Given our broader hypothesis about the relationship between semantic cognition and social cognition, we were very keen to compare this core social cognition map against the results of a meta-analysis of general semantic cognition, which was published by Becky Jackson just this year in Neuroimaging. This was very kindly provided by Becky, Dr. Jackson, and we can see in green, see this in green in the bottom panel here. The social cognition network is in red, and the overlap between social cognition and semantic cognition is in yellow. What I think is clear is that there is much in common between the two networks, suggesting that social cognitive tasks reliably engage semantic processes. The ATL is implicated, but we can also see an overlap in other key nodes of the semantic cognition network, including those implicated in semantic control. And this leads me on to the final part of my talk, which concerns our very first explorations regarding the involvement of semantic control in social interactions. It's surprising to know that despite a general acknowledgement of the importance of cognitive control for regulating social cognition, prominent general level models lack any substantive detail regarding the nature and neural basis of such mechanisms. Some authors have fairly recently begun to elucidate upon the role of domain general executive systems in social processes, such as inhibition of automatic imitation and the inhibition of prejudice. However, there are several unresolved questions, including whether there could be multiple distinguishable mechanisms of and neural systems for social control. Rich Ramsey and I recently suggested that semantic control might be particularly important for social cognition. To explore this, Veronica conducted another systematic review and meta-analysis of fMRI studies probing semantic control processes. These studies use tasks like this alternative forced choice paradigm from Beth Jeffries' group, in which semantic control demands are manipulated by varying the strength of association between a probe item and a target item. For example, salt is the probe, and pepper is the target in the strong associate and low semantic control condition, and grain is the target in the weak associate and high semantic control condition. Contrasting the weak and strong associate conditions should reveal the semantic control network. And here is the result of Veronica's meta-analysis of semantic control. This largely replicates a previous meta-analysis published by Beth Jeffries and Matt Lambin-Ralph's groups in 2013, and is consistent with an independent update published by Becky Jackson, again in Neuroimaging this year. Semantic control regions are hypothesized to include the anterior inferior frontal gyrus and the posterior middle temporal gyrus specifically. Note that these regions are partially distinct from domain general executive systems that form what is referred to as the multiple demand network. This is shown in green in the bottom row. Going back to social cognition, Veronica performed formal conjunction and contrast analyses of semantic control with each of the 5 social domains. As seen in green in this stack panel, the anterior IFG semantic control region was engaged in each one of these social domains. In the case of theory of mind, it appears that the posterior middle temporal gyrus is also engaged. Veronica's preprint includes a lovely set of follow-up analyses that confirm the ubiquity of anterior IFG involvement in social cognition, and also seem to confirm that its role in social cognitive tasks is related to cognitive effort and control. Unfortunately, I don't quite have the time to unpack them here today, so please do go down and download the preprint and take a look for yourself. I should also note that Veronica was deservedly awarded the BNS Humphreys and Riddick Prize for this excellent work at last year's autumn meeting. So, semantic control regions appear to be involved in social cognition. To end this section, I thought it was helpful to reflect for a moment on why semantic control could be helpful in the context of social interactions. The definition given earlier for semantic control the definition implicates semantic control in ensuring that aspects of conceptual information that are most critical for a task are brought to the fore, and that irrelevant information is suppressed, right? We retain a vast amount of socially relevant knowledge, including knowledge about familiar people, about the structure and relationship between social categories and their associated stereotypes, and an understanding of abstract social concepts, norms, and scripts. But only a limited portion of this information is relevant in a given social instance. Now, semantic control will need to be engaged when bottom-up automatic activation of conceptual knowledge results in multiple competing semantic representations. And this can occur frequently in social interactions because they involve often subtle or ambiguous cues, such as neutral facial expressions and bodily gestures, and/or conflicting cues such as sarcasm. And the observer can only settle upon a meaning by taking into account the wider situational and linguistic contexts. Semantic control would also need to be engaged if automatic semantic retrieval fails to activate semantic information necessary for the task at hand. And this may occur frequently in social interactions, and particularly with less familiar persons, because of a preponderance of surface features like physical characteristics over less salient features, social features, such as personality traits, preferences, and mental states. And both the selection and controlled retrieval processes for semantic cognition are associated with anterior IFG regions that were highlighted by Veronica's meta-analysis. So, to conclude, the picture that is emerging from the data I have shown you today is that the semantic cognition network is a reliable feature of the brain systems engaged in service of social interactions. The ventral ATL is a pan-category cross-modal representational hub for semantic knowledge, and it is robustly and bilaterally activated by diverse social cognitive tasks. And this reflects the engagement of semantic representations in the interpretation of social cues. The semantic control network, comprised of the ventrolateral PFC and posterior MTG, is also active across a wide range of social tasks and stimuli, and it is assumed to be playing a role in shaping the retrieval of semantic knowledge in line with task demands. Overall, domain general neurocognitive frameworks, such as the controlled semantic cognition framework, can be helpful to the social neurosciences and to neuropsychiatry in shaping the way we understand brain network activations and processes underpinning social cognition. Evidence in support of them can be used to generate falsifiable and maybe even clinically relevant predictions about latent processes underlying social interactions. This is all quite preliminary, and in our ongoing research, key questions going forward include to what extent these findings generalize across social tasks, and to what extent the framework predicts social behavior. In particular, I am keen to apply this framework to exploring mechanisms of disruption to socio-emotional impairments in pathologies affecting different parts of the semantic cognition network. So, for example, the framework predicts that in the context of temporal parietal lesions and/or damage restricted to the frontal cortex, the quality of social impairments will reflect dysregulated access as opposed to degraded knowledge of social scripts or norms. Impairments could at least be correlated with tests of executive function, although I do not believe that that is necessary for this prediction. I do not believe there is a great deal of preliminary evidence either in support of or against this hypothesis, although one can find some interesting related discussion, particularly in the context of neurodegenerative disease. And I've put a few references here. Moreover, there is, of course, a bigger picture with other regions and systems implicated, and this cannot be straightforwardly explained in terms of a simplified semantics framework. For this reason, it's going to be important to get to grips with the intersection and interaction of the semantic, default mode, and multiple demand systems that are engaged in the service of social cognition. And with that, I would like to finish by saying thank you once again to the BNS for the award and for giving me the opportunity to deliver the prize lecture. To my funders, and of course to all my wonderful mentors and collaborators, and to my lab members who of course do all the hard work these days. Thanks.